Well, hello, everyone. To kick off this session, knowing and showing an election is accurate, I'd like to start from the very beginning, and that means with the Declaration of Independence. Its opening paragraph says that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And we, of course, all know that the word men meant something different then than it does now. How do we know what the consent of the governed is? That's by elections. And for that, we go to the US Constitution. Article 1, Section 4 says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So basically, we build our representative democracy on elections, and it is our state legislatures who are in charge of them, at least in charge of the policies relating to them. I'm Wendy Underhill. I'm the director of NCSL's Elections and Redistricting Program, and I've been blessed to work for NCSL on elections policy for 10 years. And I've witnessed how creative and conscientious our legislators are in working out the details of their state's election policies. And with every new election, new questions come up and new approaches are figured out. And I'm joined today by Jennifer Morrell of the Elections Group. Jennifer has been a local election official both in Utah and in Colorado, and in recent years has become the nation's expert on techniques that can help validate election processes and results. Jennifer, I feel like we're really lucky to have you with us today.
Thanks, Wendy. It's always exciting to be with you and always a pleasure to be in front of the NCSL audience.
Great. So it would also be nice to know who that audience is today. So if you wouldn't mind, would you put your name and your state in the chat box? And one little fact, I was thinking that you might tell us whether you voted on Election Day in 2020 or you voted before Election Day in 2020. I'm assuming that everyone on this call did vote. You wouldn't be here with us if you weren't a voter, I'm figuring out. So thanks for giving us a little hint on who you are and how you voted. Our plan for now is to take 4 separate topics within the big topic of knowing and showing. And these all relate to election accuracy in one way or another. And Jennifer will give us the 101 on each of them. And then for each of those 4, she and I will consider together what are the policy options that states could have available to them. What are they interested in? You're welcome to put questions in the chat box at any point too, and we'll address them after each section. Now, wait a minute, I've just said put the questions in the chat box. It could be there's a Q&A out there. So if there's a Q&A box, put them there. We will get to those questions at the end of each of our sections. And I just want you to know too that we do have, I think 2, maybe 3 videos that are going to be built into this, and therefore both your enjoyment and your education. And the theory is that sometimes we learn better visually, or at least we learn with a nice mix of things. Let's see. And before we do this, let's see. I do want to talk with you, Jennifer, just a little bit about something that isn't so much what legislatures can legislate, and that's about the communications that local election officials do. I mean, it used to be when you were a local election official, your job was to hand out the ballots and then count them accurately. But now we're asking local election officials to be communicators. What can you share with us on that side that relates to the knowing and showing accuracy?
Yeah, well, I think it's helpful, Wendy, if we reflect for just a minute on 2020. In spite of extraordinary challenges created by this global pandemic that we're still experiencing, elected and appointed officials from both parties worked together to mitigate what could have been an extraordinary crisis. They did this by instituting health and safety protocols, recruiting and training hundreds of thousands of new poll workers, expanding early and absentee voting and other alternative voting options, and processing and tabulating a record number of mail-in ballots. But they also became expert crisis communicators, many for the first time. And as you know, most had to do that with very limited staffing. They worked to inform voters, the media, and other stakeholders, including legislators, about the facts around how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. They really were the messengers behind that hashtag we all kept seeing, Trusted Info 2020. And what was remarkable is we saw jurisdictions of all sizes provide us with virtual tours of their ballot processing facilities. Many created graphics and short videos explaining how their processes worked, how ballots would be counted, and what we all could expect as we waited for results. So by all measures, this election was the most transparent of any election we've ever seen. More local jurisdictions turned on a camera so that the world could watch the work they were doing in real time. And I think that effort revealed a couple of things. First, we saw that running elections is tedious, monotonous work. And we also saw that we still have some work to do, though, in explaining how the process works. And more importantly, in really providing evidence that the work was done fairly and accurately. So I think the theme for this discussion, knowing and showing, I think it's perfect. And I'm just really excited to be able to chat with you about some of the other ways states are doing that.
Oh, great, Jennifer. And I asked you to talk about the local election officials and communications, but I just want to offer that legislators are also communicators. Their word matters in their communities and for their constituents. So I just offer that legislators also can be thinking about going down to that election office and really getting the nuts and bolts figured out, and then sharing what they've learned about how the process works. When they talk, people listen, is what I'm suggesting. And I see that in the chat, most people voted before election day. And we know around the nation, there was a huge increase in the number of people who voted before election day. So this audience is kind of like the nation at large, but maybe even more so about voting before election day. That's not our topic for today. Let's start off with registration. That's the first of our 4 subsets on knowing and showing. Go for it.
Thank you. Well, hopefully it's no surprise when I tell you maintaining good voter records is really challenging, and we could talk about this really for hours, Wendy. But for one thing, and I think the thing that's most important for everybody to keep in mind, is that this information is constantly changing. That voter, whether we call it a voter roll or a voter database, it's constantly in flux. It's a very dynamic set of information. Every day, right? We have new voters registering, we have voters moving, we have voters dying, getting married, changing their names, voters who hear or see something in the news that sparks them to change their party affiliation. So every day across the country, election officials are processing millions of paper applications and online applications. And sometimes voters make mistakes when they're completing those forms. Sometimes election workers make mistakes when they're entering the information on those forms. And so all of this flux in information, along with this human component, means we really need a system for good quality control and review. While most of private industry and some government agencies have updated their systems to take advantage of modern technology, voter registration systems really remain largely based on 19th century tools. And when I say that, what I mean is we really rely on these handwritten applications, these paper forms, and the postal mail, which really adds to the cost and difficulty in maintaining clean voter rolls. I would point out there are plenty of states now that have invested in new or upgraded software for managing their voter registration databases. That really can improve the quality. It can reduce errors when that data gets entered into the system. And these newer systems generally have more options for reports that can help with ongoing review. And I would lump into that things like investing in good function and design of an online voter registration platform, coupled with electronic transfer of data and information from the DMV, can go a long way in improving the quality of voter rolls. So that's a really good starting place. There are other things that a state can do on their own, such as regularly running reports to look for duplicate records. I think we saw some news articles about that last year. You can pay for updated data from the USPS as part of their National Change of Address program. You can pay for Social Security death indexes so that you're receiving that data regularly. And a lot of states also receive updates from the Department of Corrections and the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, as part of their maintenance effort. One other thing that I always recommend when we're talking about registration records and the quality and integrity of those records is encouraging states to work with their GIS office so that they can integrate geospatial technology into their databases. It's just another excellent way to ensure the integrity of that database by making sure that a voter has been placed in the correct district and precinct. That means they get the right ballot. And when I think about all this data and where it comes from, the thing that irritates me but also amuses me, I guess, as a private citizen, I think about my experiences over the last few years moving, and every time I moved, organizations that I do business with and many that I don't care to do business with, they always immediately knew I had moved, updated my contact information without me having to do anything. And so I think one thing we should really key in on when we talk about the integrity of the voter database is to think as policymakers. I would encourage you to think about how information is shared, both at the state level and with federal partners, and how we can do a better job with that. When you think about all the agencies, right, that are keepers of the same information, essentially, that we have in our voter registration databases, our name, address, birth date, those sorts of things, that information is held by the DMV, Department of Revenue, Health and Human Services, Vital Records. We could go on. And I always found in working with citizens in my role as an election official, they were always perplexed to learn that if there was a life-changing event or they moved, that they had to go update that information separately with every single agency. And so I think we need to continue to look for ways to make that more seamless. So I think that's one thing we can do when we think about improving the integrity of those roles. Hopefully it's no surprise then when I say that performing, we're talking about audits today. So performing any sort of regular systematic audit of the voter database has proven to be really challenging. And there's actually only a single jurisdiction I'm aware of that has built a program of regular daily audits looking for anomalies in their database. And it's a jurisdiction that actually has done that in combination or with assistance from a team from Caltech, is more of a research endeavor. So it's something we want to keep pursuing and thinking about. But fortunately, until we find some better way to either share information or validate that information, there's a just excellent tool that state and local administrators can tap into. And it's really the very best way that a state can ensure accurate voter registration rolls. If you haven't heard of it before, there is something called the Electronic Registration Information Center. In the election community, we call it ERIC. ERIC is structured very similar to a co-op where there are board members, one from each participating state, and typically that's your state election director, are the ones who sort of set the rules and oversee the program. Currently, there are 30 states, including the District of Columbia, that are members. And each member state submits at a minimum its voter registration and motor vehicle licensing data. So that means names, addresses, dates of birth, last 4 digits of social security numbers. They've got a number of security mechanisms to ensure that's all transmitted securely. But each of those member states on a regular basis, so monthly, receives a report that shows voters who have moved within their state, voters who have moved out of state, voters who have died, duplicate registrations in the same state, and also a list of individuals who are potentially eligible to vote but are not yet registered. And those 2 things I mentioned earlier that you can pay for on your own, the USPS National Change of Address data and the Social Security Death Index, that's all included as part of the membership. And it's just really valuable information. I had the opportunity to work with the ERIC team when they were first starting this program as an election official in Utah. And it immediately helped us identify duplicate voters that would have otherwise gone undetected. But it wasn't until I took my position in Colorado as an elections director there that I saw the added cost benefits of having accurate, up-to-date addresses for voters. So obviously in a mail ballot state, there's a huge cost to ballots being returned and delivered. So being able to reduce that as a result of this maintenance, but also it reduces those last-minute requests for mail ballots, and the program in general, both the maintenance of the registration records, as well as that outreach to potentially eligible but unregistered voters, really reduce the number of provisional ballots that had to be processed. But you, instead of listening to me talk about ERIC, the ERIC team has put together this great video illustrating how ERIC membership can benefit your state. And so let's watch that.
Voter registration is the gateway to participating in our American democracy. And keeping voter rolls up to date is a challenge, mainly because Americans move so much. In any given year, tens of millions of Americans move, 2 million die, and other life changes occur. As a result, 1 in every 8 registration records isn't accurate. To fix this, several innovative states have joined with the Pew Charitable Trusts to build the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. ERIC is a cost-saving data center that helps each participating state improve the accuracy of their voter list by intelligently comparing their voter data to lots of other information, like those from the DMV, the U.S. Postal Service, the Social Security Administration, and other lists. ERIC can help states in many ways. It can compare data from many sources simultaneously, so a state can learn when a voter on their list has died or moved to another state. Then the voter's old state can contact the voter to confirm the move and update the voter list, while their new state can reach out and encourage them to register to vote in the most efficient way, usually through online voter registration. And just as importantly, privacy of data is protected by ERIC at the source. Any personal information, like dates of birth or driver's license numbers, is anonymized. And the whole program is run and owned by the participating states. Ensuring the integrity and efficiency of the voter lists should be simpler. With ERIC, it is. Take the first step at ericstates.org.
Well, Jennifer, thanks very much for bringing that video for us. I want to ask, when you were a local election official in Utah, and you said you were part of sort of the pilot or the early days of ERIC, did you get most of your duplications from out of state or from in state? I had the feeling that maybe there's a lot that we don't know within a state.
They absolutely were in state. And part of that is as states moved from this very paper-based system to an electronic voter database, as we moved from a voter database that was controlled and maintained mainly at the county level and then merged up to a statewide database, it was easy to have these sort of duplicates that maybe, especially for voters who remained in the same location, but didn't realize, they already had a registration on file, they were filing a new one, and just somehow in those sort of early sort of transitions to different systems, those duplicates didn't get caught.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my 3 adult daughters who moved from place to place in the United States, and I'm pretty sure that they've never once canceled their old registration. They do. Often what happens is when they move to a new place and they register there, a note somehow gets automatically sent to the old place saying, we've got her now. But I'm not sure if that's always working or if that's only with states that are within ERIC. Do you have a sense of that? Because sometimes the new registration in effect is supposed to cancel the old one, but how do they get the information about that?
Yeah, I think unless they're participating in ERIC, or they have some other state already has an agreement with another state, which would be a little bit unusual, but I'm not going to say it doesn't occur. I'm just not aware of it. To exchange that information, there's really no way, right, that they would get that, because as I mentioned earlier, none of these systems, whether within a state or state to state or federally, really talk to each other.
Right. And while we're talking about ERIC, we do have a question from Jen about how is it funded? Do you know what those the pricing structure looks like?
Yeah, so ERIC, each of the member states is required to pay a fee. I think there's an initial fee and then there's an annual membership fee. And that's really structured by the number of eligible voters within their states. So larger states pay more than smaller. I'm sure, Wendy, you and your team have a link that you can send to members with more to the ERIC website so that they can look a little bit closer at that.
And I guess I'll just add that it used to be something like 25,000 to join, and maybe something like 25 to 75,000 per year, like a ballpark figure. So we're not talking millions, is what I was thinking.
Yeah, the exciting thing is as more states have become members, those costs come down, right? Because we can distribute those costs to more members. So if you're wondering, is my state a member of ERIC? There's that list on there. If you're wondering why I'm not a member of ERIC, I would recommend contacting your Secretary of State. And sometimes it's not just like an unwillingness to join, but there may be something inherent within the voter database that makes it right now challenging for them. I know some states had to wait until they made some of those upgrades in order to join.
Well, and I think we've seen states where the legislature needed to affirmatively say the state could join. And there were other states where they felt they had some authority under existing laws. So it's a mixed bag, but legislation on ERIC is, or maybe it doesn't say ERIC specifically, but it says information sharing compacts is pretty common. So legislators are part of the decision making body as well as the secretaries on that. Well, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about some of the ways that people get registered to vote. And we have resources on all of these. So I guess that's my point here. The most common way that people get registered to vote is at the Department of Motor Vehicles. When you go in, it's required by federal law in most states that voter registration be offered to you at that point. So that's the most common source. And then after that, you've got online voter registration, which I believe is now available in 40 states. And then you've got the paper forms, which could be at a office, or could be the person standing in front of the public library or the grocery store saying, have you registered to vote? And I suppose there's same day registration that in some states, when you come to the polling place, if you're not already registered, you can show proof of who you are and that you live there and get registered right there on the spot. And that's what I can think of about the ways people get registered. So I'd like to ask the people who are here, how did you get registered? Or do you even remember? I mean, maybe you've been at the same address for a long time, but if you can remember, was it on paper? Any thoughts about that? And NCSL does have resources on all these different kinds of registration if they're something you're interested in. And I think, Jennifer, one thing I want to bring forward that you had said is that DMV interchange can be more automated or less automated. Do you want to add anything extra about that?
Yeah, that's right. And I probably don't need to say more automated is better. So we have fewer sort of touch points where there's an opportunity to make a data entry error. So when that information, whether it's information input by the person that's at the DMV, the citizen entering their information, or information being taken in by the DMV clerk, when that's electronically transmitted to the state voter database, one, it's a lot quicker to get that update done. And we don't have anybody in the middle sort of rekeying in that information. It's not unusual, though, for a state to take the information collected at the DMV in a paper form and then mail all of those forms or distribute those in some way to the various counties and jurisdictions for manually processing. So, you know, anytime, one thing that I found too, and I'll add this, Wendy, is when a voter can enter the information themselves and sort of review it, we see a lot higher sort of rates of good information versus filling out a form, especially when it's done online, right? There's just something about that online platform, whether it's prompting them to complete something and not leave it blank, prompting them to sign once they've printed it out or whatever they need to do, ends up being more successful than when they complete a paper form. And we won't spend time on that. I've certainly seen hundreds of thousands of those forms come across, missing information, not signed, not completed entirely. So there's something really useful about a successful registration being done electronically.
I got it. And I'm thinking about the way we all sign our signatures these days. Sometimes our handwriting gets in the way. Okay, we did have a question from Ben, and you and I are probably going to have different answers to this, Jennifer. Do you believe that this is a time where the federal government could step up and help incentivize states to adopt some uniform election practices, such as early voting, early absentee counting, early voting? And why don't you take a shot at it, and then I'll agree or disagree?
Sure, I feel like that's a little bit of a loaded question. I think certainly when we see continuity or uniformity of practice, we see sort of like trust increase, right? When we don't have something or a set of procedures or practices different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction or state to state. Just thinking specifically about the voter registration part, there is a huge opportunity, and some work has already been done federally to create a uniform set of sort of data standards so that at least voter registration databases between states have an easier time talking to each other. So it's a common data format. And that should allow for sort of some, for us to continue to sort of improve this idea or think more about this idea of auditing or testing those databases on a regular basis. So I think like that's an example of an opportunity to create some standards that doesn't really ruffle the political feathers. I think when it comes to the other practices, I would just say the more we have standardization, the easier it gets to administer.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for being honest. And here's my side on this. Standardization might make it easier to administer, but every state really is best prepared to make its own choices about what's right for them. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, it is constitutionally mandated that legislatures are in charge, not the federal government. But we do have some thoughts about the federal role. And one of those is in terms of funding. Right now, there's no expectation that the federal government will share funding for running elections. Now, there have been some tranches of money come forward. One in 2002, that was quite a while ago. And then 2 or 3 smaller ones just in the last couple of years because of election security in particular. So I'm fairly sure that if the federal government wants to support elections, the way to do it is to make a more uniform, consistent transfer of funds to the states. And it's fine if they want to have some requirements about how things are done, but it's really got to be the states who are in charge of how they do it. Let's see, and on that last question about how you all registered, in fact, you look like the American public, with most of you having registered at the DMV, one online as well. So that's the up and coming part. I think we're ready to move on to ballot accounting. And many of us don't know what that phrase means, Jennifer, so take it from the top, please.
Well, ballot accounting provides a way to consistently and accurately record the number of ballots in an election official's position, in their possession at any given point in time, and to document any changes. The policy around this often lies in your state regulations for canvassing or certifying elections, which means most states and jurisdictions perform some type of accounting, even if they don't specifically refer to it that way. But I really like that term. We've spent a lot of time over the past few years talking about post-election audits, but I think it's important to note that an audit is only as good as the paper trail you're auditing. So when I say ballot accounting, I'm lumping in things like the ballot reconciliation forms that are completed by poll workers at polling locations, the ballot tracking and control logs for absentee and mail ballots, chain of custody forms that are used to physically track who took possession of ballots and when. And this ballot reconciliation and chain of custody, these things really become the foundation of your audits paper trail. So if we're going to talk about audits, it's so important that we talk about ballot accounting first. That maybe the easiest way to sort of think about it is it's a way to ensure votes have not been dropped or lost or added as a result of human error or some failure in the voting equipment. And it really ensures that that ballot record remains complete and intact from the moment ballots are cast all the way through the audit and through those final steps of storage or storing them for retention. So think about ballot accounting as evidence or proof that the ballot record is trustworthy. It's a tangible document that we can turn to when we're looking for that validation. As I said, most of the guidance for this will be outlined in the administrative rulemaking process. So for example, in Colorado, the law around the canvass board is fairly short and brief. It says that they will reconcile the ballots cast to confirm that the number of ballots counted in the election doesn't exceed the number of ballots cast, and then to do a review, a precinct by precinct review, right, to confirm that the number of ballots cast does not exceed the number of registered voters. That's pretty standard and pretty typical, I think, across states. But if you look at the administrative rules in Colorado around this, they're far more extensive. They really were designed to support robust post-election audits that get performed. So I won't go through them all, but they are things like having a detailed ballot log that accounts for every ballot issued and received on a daily basis, a daily accounting at each polling location. So every day a polling location is open, whether that's early voting or on election day, a daily accounting of the number of ballots that were printed on demand, that were cast, unvoted ballots, spoiled ballots, provisional ballots. And then there's this fairly detailed accounting that takes place after a polling location closes, and including sort of requiring officials to explain any discrepancies in those numbers. So I would just encourage everyone to take a closer look both at your own state laws and the administrative rules around canvassing or certifying to ensure they support these sort of robust ballot accounting practices. Like I said, they just such an important foundation before we start thinking more about the tabulation audits.
Jennifer, I'm thinking that Santa Claus might have something to offer it here, making a list and checking it twice. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about when you talk about a log?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So sometimes it is just as simple as when we talk about in-person voting, it's a log of everybody that checked in at that polling location. It's that total number of voters either in the poll book, the paper poll book, the electronic poll book. And we want that number, right? We had 100 voters check in. We want to make sure that our total number of ballots in our ballot box, whether those are provisional or regular ballots cast, equals 100. And we have to take in account as well any blank or unvoted ballots that we receive. So it's just exactly that. It's a simple checklist. And you know, what's interesting about it, Wendy, is it sounds simple on its face. And I say this to everybody when I give presentations on ballot accounting, but it's often one of the most challenging things actually to do well and to get right. I think we're getting better at it, but I think there's still some room for improvement.
And I'm getting the sense, you kind of set this up that the ballot accounting is good because we can audit, but I'm getting the sense from what you're saying, the ballot accounting is also good because now you know where your ballots are, and you just, if you're 10 off, you can say, where did those 10 go? So
that's
it's
right.
Like, just makes the process better, even if you're not auditing along the way.
Yeah, that's right. Before we even start into the audit, right, before we start looking at whether the voting system operated the way it should be, and I know we're going to talk about that in just a minute, we want to make sure that, again, just using this number as an example, if we show that there should have been 100 ballots cast, we want to make sure, independent of the voting system, that we show 100 ballots were scanned, right? So it's both the foundation of the audit, but also as we're thinking about knowing and showing, we're thinking about, are there tangible things throughout the whole sort of spectrum of election administration where we can provide proof or documentation that the work was done correctly, that procedures were followed, that there was accountability. This is one way to do it, and everybody wins, right? The election officials have documented proof to back up the things that they're saying, and voters and other stakeholders can feel confident too in knowing that that proof is there, and they don't just have to take somebody's word that the work was done correctly.
So from the let's make this concrete. How could there be a discrepancy? Is this people spilling coffee on a ballot? Is this people crumpling a ballot and asking for another one? How can we have a discrepancy, especially I'm thinking in a polling place?
Yeah, so in a polling place, we can have a number of different things. We can have spoiled ballots that don't get accounted for. So it's not an actual real issue that took place, but a voter can start to vote a ballot, and for whatever reason, again, depending on whether they're voting a paper ballot or they're voting on a machine, change their mind, or they get to the point of casting it and say, I've changed my mind, I want to do that again. That's not uncommon, actually. We have issues where we have fleeing voters. Believe it or not, that's actually not uncommon. I can't think of a single election I ran that somebody didn't start the voting process, meaning they had checked in and then just decided to walk away and leave. So it's not that there are actual issues of fraud or malfeasance happening. It's just that we want to have such tight controls that when those numbers don't add up, we have a way to account for it. You may have a voter that checks in, begins the check-in process, and then we quickly realize they're a provisional voter, right? So we give them a different type or style of ballot. We want to make sure there's an accounting for that, so that when we get to the end of the canvass process, we have a way to say, this many provisionals were issued, here's how many were counted, here's how many were rejected. I think one of the areas where I think we do a pretty good job when it comes to in-person. We start to think about the mail ballot process. We have a lot more movement happening there, right? We have ballots that come in, they're delivered by the post office or collected from drop boxes, and they move through different areas or processes. So we really want this accounting, knowing that at every stage, some ballots may be removed. So they go through signature verification. Some ballots just, whether you do signature verification or you have some other validation process in your state, there's going to be some of those that get removed during that process. We want to be able to account for those. They move along to be opened. Well, some states have a requirement. We all remember the naked ballots in Pennsylvania, where if they weren't sealed in their security envelope, they would need to be removed and not counted. So as they move through the process, we just want a way to ensure ballots have not been lost or added. So again, it sounds really simple, but when you're talking about thousands of ballots, without a good program in place, it can be challenging to get those numbers right.
I'm glad you mentioned those naked ballots in Pennsylvania. Not all states require that your absentee ballot be put inside of one envelope and then into another envelope to mail. But the question was state law specific about whether you could count the ballot itself if it had not been properly put in that secrecy envelope inside of the one that went through the Postal Service. And this is a perfect example of how state law is often not absolutely locked down solid. Nobody thought about this until this year when so many people voted absentee ballots. So I think that's the kind of fine tuning that states are looking at. NCSL does have a resource called After the Voting Ends, and it does cover canvass deadlines. That's more or less the local accounting, how many ballots were for this candidate and that candidate. The certification deadlines, that's mostly at the state level. And then we have voter intent laws all captured. Jennifer, what is a voter intent law, and thoughts about better ones or less good ones? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's something everybody should be taking a look at, actually. So voter intent laws really mainly apply to hand-marked paper ballots. So obviously we saw quite a few more of those with this exponential growth we saw in November of mail ballots. And it simply means if a voter has failed to mark a ballot correctly, meaning to completely fill in the oval. So we might see things like an X or a check mark or circling the candidate's name, something that might make it difficult for the voting system to capture that voter's intent or to capture that ballot. There's sort of a human review process that takes place using a set of state guidelines to determine, is this a valid vote? Mail ballot states have been dealing with a higher quantity, right, of hand-marked paper ballots, so they tend to have more robust voter intent guidelines. There's a federal requirement that requires every state to have some, but some of those that have traditionally had less than 10% of their voters voting absentee, their voter intent guidelines might be fairly brief. So I think it's something worth looking at. Again, this is one area where I would think you would want every jurisdiction within a state making the same sort of decisions about whether a vote casts uniformly. So it's just a really useful thing to have. And there's lots of good examples. Virginia, Washington, Colorado are a couple that come to mind, but there are certainly plenty of states that have drafted and adopted good guidelines there.
Well, I did not know that it was federal law that there'd be something on that. So I'm super happy that you shared that with us. And we've got a question here from Tom. A lot of this accountability falls on election workers who might have just a few hours of training and deal with this only once or twice a year. Are there best practices for training those workers?
Yeah, there are. I think you guys are going to share a couple of my guides. There's one called Knowing It's Right, Part 4, Ballot Accounting Best Practices. I won't spend a lot of time, watching the clock, and we have a lot to cover.
Yeah.
But Tom, the best thing that election officials can do is before they even deploy that form or that log out into the field to really conduct focus groups and go through some sort of iteration and making sure that it's intuitive, that those sections are clearly broke out. And sometimes when we deal with forms, I don't know, we really like to just sort of layer on the legalese and the government sort of terms, and that's not super useful when you have people that aren't familiar with those terms or aren't familiar with the process. So the way that those forms are designed, we have really good examples of this. There are definitely jurisdictions where some improvement can be made. So I know you guys will send out links to the guide. Take a look at that. That it gives you some sort of idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about good design. And then making that a part of the training, I'll just add that hands-on training, even in a virtual environment. We saw some jurisdictions doing a better job of that, where they would actually email out the forms so that the election workers had a chance to look at them and review them and fill them out while they were doing the virtual training. Hopefully we all get back to in person. And I just would say a PowerPoint's not enough. They've got to actually go through the motions prior to the stress of those few hours of election night when they're trying to close things up accurately. So you're spot on with the question.
Excellent. And this is another place where sometimes a state law can dictate how much training is offered to local election officials, but mostly it's the training that the chief election official would share with the county. Now, you're right, Jennifer, that I've been making us go a little too slowly here. So we're going to move on to chain of custody. And we do have a nice video in this section. So lead us in a little bit. You've mentioned it, but maybe just a touch more, and then we'll get to the video.
Yeah, so as you said, I mentioned it already, and I think it's important to remember chain of custody. This form is not unique to election administration, right? We certainly see it used quite a bit in the court of law when we talk about evidence, and that's exactly what it is. It's providing assurances that ballots are authentic and accounted for at every stage. So when they're printed, issued, delivered, cast, transported, scanned, duplicated, reconciled, audited, stored, all those things, that chain of custody log, again, if this is a physical, tangible thing, right, that gets completed and filled out by election workers, it becomes a story, really, that follows a ballot's journey through the voting process. And it's meant to provide evidence to relieve any uncertainty that ballots have been tampered with by indicating when and who took possession of them each and every time they get physically moved. So I mentioned some of those examples. One of the most, I think, talked about this year was around ballots being retrieved from a Dropbox, and chain of custody logs. Again, they just provide how the ballots were secured physically and electronically. So often we'll see things used like uniquely numbered tamper evidence seals, whether we're talking about blank ballots being delivered to a polling location where poll workers have to review that seal and verify that it matches what's on the paperwork before they can open the container and issue those ballots, or those teams collecting ballots from a Dropbox review and document those seals so that we have a way to sort of prove that. And this applies to both logs for tangible ballots, paper ballots, also can apply to ballots received or sent electronically by our military and overseas voters. So it might include a log with the fax number or the email address to which the ballot was transmitted, and the date the ballot packet was sent or received, and the initials of the employee transmitting. So they can come in a lot of different forms. They serve a lot of different purposes. And I think we're going to watch a video around the chain of custody process, typically used for ballots returned to a secure Dropbox, so you can kind of better envision what I'm talking about.
I'm Jennifer Morrell. I've been a local election official for about 8 years in both Utah and Colorado, and now I'm also a partner at the Elections Group. Ballot box retrieval teams on the outside looking in might seem like a really simple operation, but actually they're tasked with a number of steps every time they go out to collect from a single box. And they do this sort of chain of custody retrieval process at every box, at every location, every day throughout the whole election period. And it starts just by identifying the box that they're at. So that might be a box name, it might be a location. They note the date and the time that they're there. Both members of the retrieval team are listed on this form. They also have to identify the box or the bag that they're going to transfer ballots into these box or bags, and those are usually identified with a security seal number. After they do that, they need to note the security seal of the box that they're retrieving from, that it was intact. So simply just checking a box saying, yes, the seal was intact, and initialing that was the case. It's just absolute detail. Then they would remove the security seal and they would record that on that chain of custody form. And then they're going to go through a checklist of sort of each motion, each step for retrieving. That starts with inspecting the box to ensure that there aren't any signs of tampering or vandalism. Then they're going to unlock the door, transfer ballots into their bag, inspect the inside of the box to ensure there's no ballots left stuck against the wall or leaning somewhere. They're going to inspect the ground to make sure no ballots have fallen. They're going to seal that transfer box or bag that they're taking ballots back to the election office in. And they're going to record the seal numbers on that box. They're going to verify that the door of the ballot box has been locked. And both members of that ballot retrieval team are going to check that the lock has been locked, and they're going to note that or check that off. Then they're going to place a new security seal on the door. They record the new security seal that they just placed on the door. Then they transfer everything back into their vehicle. They're going to check through all of those things I just mentioned. They're going to go and make a check and verify that all the procedures were completed and recorded, and they're going to initial that. They'll also make a note if there's service required for that box or anything, just maintenance-wise, that needs to be attended to. And then the very last thing they're going to do is they're going to note the time that they finished. They'll record that time. And once again, they'll initial both driver teams when they left that location and started heading off to the next one. And those steps are repeated all over again as soon as they arrive at the next location.
My favorite part of watching that, Jennifer, was when the person was reaching up inside, because I'm thinking of the number of socks that get stuck inside of a dryer, and that's what they were kind of doing, pulling those out. I guess in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we just keep rolling. What do you think? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. My favorite thing to talk about is post-election audits. So it would be a shame if we missed that.
All right. Well, we'll come back if we need to, but maybe I can't stop myself and make one point. And that's that what you're talking about when you're talking about chain of custody is the opposite of cybersecurity. It's old-fashioned security. It's on the ground security. And in this day when we talk so much about cybersecurity, I'd hate to have us lose track of the everyday bipartisan team, do it all right kind of security.
Yeah, Wendy, I think that's a great point. Physical security is just as important, just as valued, and probably plays a bigger role than most people realize in elections.
Right. All right. Well, take us to post-election audits.
Sure. So let's start this conversation, though, by thinking about why we should audit elections in the first place. So any audit, not just tabulation audits, should provide election officials a way to detect voting system errors. So whether that's human error, misconfiguration, or hacking, should provide accountability to your voters. It should deter fraudulent activity. And it should assure that votes were issued and counted and reported accurately. And maybe most important to folks like me that have ran elections, it provides you with feedback for process improvement. So we focus quite a bit on post-election audits, and that's what we're going to talk about here. But I just want to point out that there are a number of places, from processing a voter registration application, as we talked about earlier, to programming your election, to issuing and receiving ballots, and finally to tabulating ballots, where we do have an opportunity to really pause and conduct some sort of audit or test to provide validation of the work that's been done. So let's talk about risk limiting audits, or RLA, or RLAs, as I'll refer to them probably for the rest of the time. An RLA is a post-election tabulation audit, so that's important. We think about when it takes place, where we examine a random sample of voted ballots to provide a statistical level of confidence that the outcome of the election is correct. We know it's it's been nationally recognized, right, as a reliable method to validate the integrity of your voting equipment, to verify accuracy of your results. And the thing that's unusual about it is the way that it's been designed to detect and correct outcome changing errors in vote tabulation. And just as importantly, it's an efficient way to audit. And what I mean by that is, when the margin of victory in the targeted contest is tight, we want to examine more ballots to reach our level of confidence that the outcome is correct. In elections where the margin is wide, we can examine fewer ballots and still reach that same level of confidence in the outcome. And so the efficiency part is really important. A couple of things I'll just throw out quickly to keep in mind when we're thinking about legislation around RLAs. We want to develop and establish policy that is not over prescriptive. The goal really should be strengthening voter confidence and election transparency. And we can do this by creating a framework that's easy for everybody to understand and implement without being over prescriptive. And so that means not prescribing the method or the process or setting a specific risk limit, but rather establishing risk limiting audits as the method for conducting a post-election tabulation audit, and then allowing rulemaking to sort of fill in the procedural things. And the reason for this is it's still very much a pioneering method of auditing, and we want the law to allow for some innovation as new methods of auditing are developed and as our voting system technology advances. Quickly, just a couple of things that you would want to include in that statutory language, and that's that the audit is completed prior to final certification. That's a little different. I know in some states there are audits that are performed after certification. We want to ensure that all types of ballots are included in the audit, so whether those are ballots cast in person, by absentee, by mail, early voting, provisional, otherwise. We want to provide a report prior to the audit that includes our unofficial sort of final tabulated vote results, complete the audit in public view, and then provide details of the audit for the public after it's been completed. And those three things really are what build in the transparency. So a couple of things, I mentioned a lot of the details then ideally are turned over to the Secretary of State or the state election board, can be tasked with the rulemaking around specific procedures and how to implement this type of audit. One thing that's been effective, I'd say really effective in other states that have tackled this, is to create some sort of working group in conjunction with the promulgation of rules. So this could include auditing experts. I've seen the state auditor be involved, and their team has been phenomenal because they do this right every day. You might consider equipment vendors or local election officials especially should be part of that working group in sort of considering what the best practices for conducting an RLA in your state might look like. Because as you said, Wendy, state officials know their voters, they know their voting culture, state and local officials, and legislators, and they should be the ones sort of determining how to take this method and turn it into something that's going to be useful and appropriate in their state. So that rulemaking might include things like the procedures to conduct an RLA, criteria for which contests will be selected, determining the risk limit, how those audit boards are designated, and the security procedures around collecting this collection, right, of ballots that we're going to audit. So much that I want to talk about here. So the time frame for implementing the audit is a really important consideration. And if you don't remember anything else about this, I would highly recommend thinking about conducting a pilot program or writing law that sort of builds in a pilot program. And I can, share, if anybody's interested, contact Wendy and I'll share with her some states that have done this really well. So what that does is we create this process where prior to making this type of post-election audit, the formal official method of auditing, we have some pilot experiences where election officials get to sort of understand and explore the different methods for conducting an RLA and really working through the technology requirements to assist them in conducting it and ensuring that they can do all of this in the time frame. So being able to do it prior to certification. And that is one other policy area where, there is some thought that we need to take into account. Might mean moving back deadlines if we want to incorporate this sort of post-election audit work. Recount laws are another place where we find this sort of nexus, I guess, of what this robust type of audit can do and how it might replace or change or has the potential to replace or change recount laws. So I would encourage anybody listening today who wants to learn more about the mechanics of an RLA to read through my guides. One thing I'll just mention is RLAs are really a methodology, and there are several different methods that can be used to conduct an RLA depending on some different criteria, the voting system and how elections are conducted. And each method has its own requirements, its own benefits, its own drawbacks. I think we have time. We have a quick 2-minute video that I collaborated on with the Center for Tech and Civic Life that sort of illustrates those 3 methods.
There are 3 methods for conducting risk-limiting audits: ballot polling, batch level comparison, and ballot level comparison. To conduct a ballot polling audit, all you need is voter verifiable paper ballots. You know who reportedly won, and by how much. To audit the contest, you randomly retrieve a ballot and manually examine and tally the votes for that contest. Then you retrieve a second ballot, then a third. You continue to tally randomly selected ballots until you have statistical confidence that the correct candidate won. In other words, you look for evidence that the winner won by a similar margin as originally reported. Like the other 2 methods for risk-limiting audits, with a ballot polling audit, the smaller the margin of victory, the more ballots you'll usually need to count. If you discover major discrepancies, you'll end up doing a full recount. Ballot polling audits verify that the outcome of the election is correct. For a batch comparison audit, you need a voting system that can provide subtotal reports by batches. For example, each precinct could be a batch, or even each scanner. To audit, you randomly select a batch, then you manually tally every ballot in that batch. Then, you compare your count to the reported subtotals. This process repeats until you have statistical confidence that the correct candidate won. Batch comparison audits verify that the outcome of the election is correct, and also provide some insight into possible tabulation errors. To conduct a ballot comparison audit, you need the ability to produce a cast vote record that can be matched to physical ballots. A cast vote record is an electronic record of how the voting equipment interpreted the choices made on each and every ballot. Physical ballots should be numbered, labeled, or organized so they can be matched to their digital records. To audit, you randomly select ballots and compare the physical ballot to its digital record. This method is more efficient than the other 2 methods since you look at fewer ballots to reach the same level of statistical confidence. Ballot comparison audits provide the deepest level of insight into possible tabulation and process errors. They also verify that the outcome of the election is correct. Learn more at techandciviclife.org.
Jennifer, when I think about this, it sounds a little bit like, well, duh, we should all do it, but it's not actually easy to make the shift. And it is usually legislation that drives it. And you suggested that the legislation could be a pilot. Can you tell us how many states currently do this, and how many do you know how many have approved pilots? I think we're talking a handful or under 2 handfuls anyway.
Yeah, so there are actually 13 states that either have a requirement. So you have Utah and Rhode Island, that's their official method of auditing. You have a handful of states, and I should pull up my chart while I'm talking, but that have allow for it. So Oregon, Washington, California, Ohio. I'll try to remember off the top of my head.
We can get it in.
Yeah, so it's an option, meaning you can do a traditional type audit, or you can do a risk limiting audit. Then you have states like Nevada and Georgia who have these statutory requirements to initiate a pilot experience or project over a course of a couple of years and report back to the legislature on how the pilot went. Assuming everything goes well, that becomes their primary method of auditing. So in Georgia, that deadline, I think, was last November. In Nevada, it's 2022. And then we have just this spattering of other states and jurisdictions, some that have done bigger pilot projects. So Michigan and Pennsylvania are good examples where they've been piloting how this might work in the hopes of getting legislation passed to make this their primary method of audit. And then we just have jurisdictions across the country that I sort of lump into that 13 state category where, you know, one or more pilots have taken place where just an individual county administrator has wanted to see how they can make that work.
So I've heard you mention voter confidence, and yet we know that it's a little tricky to explain this process. Can you connect the dots for us on how doing this post-election function might be able to have an impact on voter confidence?
Yeah, so I'll put a caveat there in that it's one thing and what I think is a layered approach, right? When we talk about confidence, we're talking about all the layers of security. We're talking about compliance audits that probably should be done and in some cases are done around standard, you know, operating procedures. We're talking about these other types of audits that I mentioned. So I think it's one piece in building that trust in validating the outcome of the election. But essentially, you know, in the past, for states that have done traditional audits, we might randomly select certain precincts or certain districts, and we just audit a set quantity of ballots in that selection. What's different about RLAs and why I think hopefully it makes people feel more confident is that all ballots, the whole universe of ballots in that state or that jurisdiction, are all equally eligible to be randomly selected for auditing. We do a human review, so that's one of the requirements of an RLA. It's not a machine doing this, but we want to do it independent of the voting system. It relies on a log that the election official has to keep independent of the voting system. And then it's that efficiency place where I started, where the tighter the race, the more ballots we want to look at to give the candidate and voters and everybody else that confidence that the outcome was right. And when the margin is wide, we still want to perform an audit, but we can look at fewer ballots to still reach that level of confidence. So it's really about confirming the outcome. I think we're getting better at explaining what it is and how it works. But it's one piece, and what I hope will be, as we look towards the future, you know, a number of pieces in sort of knowing and showing our elections were correct.
I've got a couple more questions for you, but I just want to say if anyone else has questions on anything we've covered, or frankly, I think Jennifer could handle any question about elections. So if you've got anything that's on your mind, by all means, put it in the chat. So would it be fair to say that a recount is sort of like a risk limiting audit that was where it was so tight you had to look at every single ballot? Are they related or are they separate functions?
Yeah, so they're really separate functions, and it depends on how the recount was administered. So in some states or jurisdictions, a recount just means a rescanning of all the paper ballots or re-uploading the electronic files from the precinct scanners or the other voting equipment and have the voting system read that again. You know, certainly we do have some recounts that are done by hand. The risk limiting audit is always a manual review, independent of knowing what the outcome should be of the election, of the, you know, final result. So it's a blind sort of enter of what I'm seeing on the ballot. And then we compare that to what was officially tabulated. So that's one difference. The other thing too is recounts. Right, we know some are automatically triggered. So we have some legislation that if the margin is within a certain percentage, it automatically triggers a recount. In other states, it has to be requested by the candidate. In some states, they make that easier. It might be no cost, and so anybody can request a recount for any reason. In other states, it's a little more prohibitive, right? Because there might be a cost attached to that. So having an audit every election, I think needs to be viewed a little bit different than a recount. And then I'll just add one final thing. I don't know if you caught when I was kind of trying to quickly go through the RLA process, is the way that risk limiting audits are designed. So we have a traditional audit where we might review our random, ballots from, we've randomly selected a certain number of precincts, and we get to the end and we're done. With an RLA, we do our audit, we input our results. Often we use software to sort of help facilitate that. And if we haven't met our level of confidence, so if there are discrepancies identified in the audit by design is meant to escalate. We need to draw another sample and we'll review those. Have we met our level of confidence? Yes, great, we can stop. If we haven't, meaning we're finding more discrepancies, we want to escalate it further. And so it's designed to continue to escalate until either we've met that level of confidence or we've done essentially a full hand recount. And so one of the ironies for me when I was running elections in Colorado was the first time I did a full official risk limiting audit. We did that, no discrepancies, everything was fine. But because the races in this, it was a municipal election, were so tight, I had the statutory requirement of doing 5 recounts. And so it was just like so odd to think like the irony here. So I think it's definitely an area where it's worth exploring a little bit more legislatively, how those two can mesh up a little better.
All right, and here's your last question, Jennifer. We've talked about how we know and show to the public as a whole that the whole election was done accurately. How does an individual voter know that their ballot got counted? And I'll give you a hint. I'm thinking of ballot tracking, and so I sent in an absentee ballot.
Right. So that's the best way, right? If a state or jurisdiction has that tracking capability to show you not only when the ballot was sent to you, from the county or the jurisdiction or from the ballot printer, when it was received, and also the status of that. So was it accepted and counted? Great. Was it rejected for various reasons that if there's a cure process around signatures, that sort of thing. So that's, I think that's been a great sort of advancement in giving people that level of confidence and being able to clearly see when their ballot was accepted and know that went through. But I will just add, that's the other really cool component about the RLA is for the states that have adopted this as their official method of auditing. All of those results, all of those audit files, all of those final reports are all made public. So for the individual that's really curious or really wants to sort of understand how that played out in a bigger picture, not just their own ballot, hopefully that provides that as some additional proof or evidence to them as well.
All right, Jennifer, we are going to call this a wrap. You've shared a whole lot with us. Would you just give us, are you willing to have anybody contact you who's been online?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer at electionsgroup.com, and I'm sure Wendy and her team will share that out as well. So yeah, happy to help however I can.
So I guess I just want to sort of end on a note of optimism. I think what you've shared with us makes me think that, first of all, election officials have generally done a great deal to make elections run according to prescription, state law. And that you've got ideas for our future. So maybe it's a good opportunity to think our democracy is alive and well. And so for that, I really appreciate your help, Jennifer. And thank you. And to everybody who's with us, thanks for joining us. And feel free to reach out anytime. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Wendy.